Okay, then. More about THC. So let's bring this forward and put it out there. Because again, it seems like within the bubble, the subculture of those who are using weed, cannabis, marijuana, whatever you want to call it, uh, they seem to have this idea that THC is where it's at, and it's probably because that's what they is giving them the buzz, their addiction to. But you don't hear them saying, "Oh, this is a buzz," as much as a chilling out. Well, you don't say that about alcohol necessarily either. It's chilling out with. Um, Regardless, that's there's a whole separate video perhaps I might do around the psychological approach and to it, the what people believe it's doing to them and how they feel about it while they're taking it. Um, because your beliefs can change how you feel about what you're doing, and while you're doing it. So it's human brains complex like that. So cannabis effects on brain structure, as briefly hinted at before with the THC. Uh, the brain structure, function, and cognition considerations, medical uses of cannabis. This is a bit more of a scientific article. I'll put a link below. So, abstract background: cannabis is the most widely used illicit substance worldwide. Well, the most widely psychoactive drug would be caffeine. Anyway, the legislation for recreational and medicinal purposes has substantially increased its availability and use in the United States. Objectives: decades of research have suggested that recreational cannabis uses confers cannabis use confers risk for cognitive impairment across various domains. The worst part of this is THC. It's always seems to come back with THC. I've looked at other things, trying to understand it, many articles, and what they're telling us is like, oh, it's THC, and these are different scientific papers, different things. They're all working towards one goal, trying to analyze the side effects of this. And they always come up with, hey, THC is not really that wise to be in your bloodstream. So there are receptors in the brain that these cannabinoids can fit into. So this is why they're called cannabinoid receptors, but other things can fit in there. That's the same with caffeine, by the way. The adenosine receptors for feeling sleepy in the brain, you could say they're caffeine receptors actually keep you awake because they fit into the receptor and block the adenosine from getting in there, among other things. I've talked about that before. It's very important, I think, to understand how receptors and transmission from one neuron to another, neurochemical structures, neurochemical communication across neurons. I think it's very important to try and understand that from a understanding of what we're using that puts in our bloodstream and arrives past the blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barrier is a barrier that is supposed to be protecting the brain, but things get in there that nature thinks, oh, it's one of these things, whatever. It's natural to when we plug it in with this neuron, whatever, in a very layman way. Very layman way to describe it. But then it's not quite the thing that should be used and not quite the thing that should be in there, right? So, methods with substantial evidence for the role of endocannabinoid system in neural development and understanding that brain development continues into early adulthood. That's really important as well, because a lot of the recreational stuff, alcohol, drug use, LSD, cannabis, um, yeah, it tends to involve younger generations, younger adults than older who are using this, and brain morphology is a thing. The plasticity that can change in various ways, and not really good ways either. Anyway, reading on to the methods. Early adulthood, it says the rising use of cannabis in adolescence and young. So we know this. I've talked about this in a previous video. So we move down, scroll down, and endocannabinoid system is, I don't know how to pronounce this, but phylogenetically old, having been identified in the most primitive animals with a neuronal network in animals. I can't pronounce that. I'm going to try. N R Arachidon no lithanelo mean. I just sound like a mumbling idiot. Yeah, I knew this was going to be difficult, but they're looking into this. This is that chemical and another are the major endocannabinoids, many of their effects, and those of phytocannabinoids are mediated by CB1 and CB2 receptors. So we're saying these more natural, what's intended to be in there, although they're pronounceable perhaps, but not by me, fit into the CB1 and CB2 receptor, which primarily couple to G proteins. So these combine with proteins before they get into the receptor as well, I think is what they're saying. Proteins of the GI and GO classes, although some cannabinoids engage other receptors. For example, transient receptors, potential channels for, and other proliferation activated receptors. So it can leak into fitting into other receptors in the brain and probably doing what caffeine does, blocking what should be going into those receptors. With the, I'm skipping some of this because this is a deep dive scientific paper, and I'm like, a deer in the headlights trying to read this. Within the brain, CB1 receptors are expressed in cortical areas involved in higher cognitive functions. Now, again, if you're blocking something in the receptors that part of a brain area responsible for higher thinking, then you're in the way of, especially if this is during adolescence where the brain is developing these higher cognitive functions, the last parts of a brain to develop throughout our growth, our life. We need these things to develop properly. But now, shove some THC in there, shoves it into the CB1 receptors, and it will cause issues. People become addicted. They want that buzz, and the receptors get kind of change in structurally a tiny bit as well, which deadens the effect of the fitting in of what should be in there, although if it's left to go in absence of the THC long enough, you get a recorrection of that because of the neuroplasticity. This also happens with caffeine fitting into receptors where it kind of misshapes a tiny bit, and because of the misshaping, it kind of ruins perhaps sometimes the effectiveness of adenosine, and you wonder why you can't sleep at night, but you feel exhausted anyway. And caffeine can do that anyway. It's like you're a machine that is run on overdrive. You're absolutely exhausted, but it's not shutting down. Why can't you shut down? You got those jitters, nervousness, migraines. That's caffeine addiction. But other things can cause it, but caffeine addiction will cause those things as well. So within the brain, CB1 receptors are expressed in cortical areas, higher thinking, involved in higher thinking, cognitive function, midbrain regions associated with motor control. So this is why, like in the previous video, I said it's affecting higher cognition, it's affecting motor control because it's fitting in. This is what's happening in the brain. It fits in the receptors of neurons, in the neurons, in those specific parts of a brain. Don't go thinking, oh, it's just in the brain. Which part it's in and what part that part does is crucial to understanding why this THC addiction that is rife in society is bad news. It really is. So the endocannabinoid system plays a role in homeostasis and neuroplasticity, including neurogenesis and refinement of neuronal connections. What that means is neuroplasticity is neurons adapting, making new connections and so on. But again, this interferes with this. So your brain's not developing structurally properly. And the preservation of some neurons is kind of been interfered with as well. So this is what they mean by homeostasis and neuroplasticity. Increased endocannabinoid signaling is associated with reduced stress response, improved emotion regulation, and increased reward signaling. So let me run that by you again. Increased endocannabinoid signaling. That means the endocannabinoid system itself communicating efficiently and effectively how it should do across the neurons within that brain area naturally help with the stress response and so on. You're interfering with the stress response with THC. Again, it's why people get paranoid, they get really psychotic. Again, look at somebody that the community I kind of mingle with, they know who Mr. Black Wolf is. That's his avatar, his username. And THC has absolutely fried his brain. The paranoia is through the roof. The vitriol is through the roof. The aggression. The man is actually psychotic. And we talked about psychosis, and it is. I'm very convinced it's because he smokes too much of this, and he boasts about it. He's just smoked the weed, and he again is another individual I think has confused the best with the worst. THC being the worst, CBD used in the right kinds of ways, very effective and antipsychotic properties, whereas THC, because too much at these ridiculous percentages I've talked about, is going to drive you absolutely psychotic. Um, so let's read on. I don't understand everything in this article. It's very sciencey. There's numbers. There's the things that look like equations, but we're trying to do our best. So again, increased cannabinoid signaling associated with reduced stress. Excuse me. Improved emotion regulation and increased reward signaling. Endocannabinoids modulate the function of diverse neurotransmitter systems, some of which may have opposing roles, to the extent that exo, exogenously administered cannabinoids affect the same targets. Not sure what I mean exogenous. Um, I think as in a foreign way, I think, not the usual chemical, but THC. The effects can resemble or diverge from those of endogenous, yeah, like native versus non native, natural. I think that's what they're saying. Don't quote me on that. If you know what the different terms mean, please tell me and post below. Cannabinoids, depending on the research, sorry, cannabinoids, depending on the respective actions at relevant receptors, notably the generally high potency of synthetic cannabinoids relative to, yeah, I was saying, natural versus synthetic. Uh, in cannabis has led to substantial problems with toxicity. Yeah, when you're smoking weed, you're having you people don't understand what really natural versus synthetic necessarily is. Um, there's extractions of things out of nature put into things that are like you could take all the sugars out of a banana, then make a banana smoothie, and now so much so that you just all the sugars, all the fluids, and there's no fiber left. Now you've got something that didn't really exist in nature and doing a very unnatural thing because it's not in its most natural state. You really created something else when you've extracted it. And you can extract THC from this plant, um, cannabis, and then you could say, oh, well, this is the best THC, whatever high percent, but it belongs in combination with all these other things, hundreds of different chemicals actually, not just CBD and THC in the plant. And they collaborate, not collaborate, but they, well, have that balance. The biological system will find how to use it in the most balanced way. But now we artificially extract that which we label as natural and then use it in an artificial way. And yeah, it's not really safe that way. So this is what they're talking about. THC. It shows it has led to substantial problems with toxicity interfering with this system that would normally encourage its own neuroplasticity adaptation, which is decreased. It also decreases REM sleep, standing for rapid eye movement. Caffeine, by the way, once the caffeine's gone, you have a proper REM sleep anyway. But during the REM sleep, with the presence of these cannabinoids, the REM sleep is shorter. Caffeine doesn't necessarily do that. You know, it's not interfering once. If you've found it, if you're comfortable enough to find sleep properly anyway, caffeine's not interfering by that point. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to sleep properly. or what you think is properly, as opposed to THC. You go to sleep and you think you're sleeping properly, but you're not. You're having a much shorter dream period. That's where what happens during REM sleep, which is the science behind that. The people who study this, who are qualified, will tell you shortened REM sleep is detrimental and will cause paranoia and it shorten your memory. So number one, it's shortening because you don't have a proper processing going on that happens during REM sleep. Um, the working out of problems as well during REM sleep happens is why sometimes ever had a bright idea in the middle of the night, you woke up and you think, that's what it was. That's because things are happening naturally. Where you give your brain a problem to work on, by the morning, you might get even closer. You might get a solution, whatever. But that's why. But REM sleep that's atrophied, you're never gonna get that because it's not allowed to do what it does naturally. So there's number one, the REM sleep being reduced, shortening short-term memory, which lowers the chance of the short-term entering the long-term memory. Because there are two systems literally in the brain that do that, short-term and long-term, and one needs the other, right? In a most natural state. But number two, interfering with the neuroplasticity structure, the adaptation, is going to hinder again memorizing, remembering things, learning things. So it's double-edged sword here. You just people end up being really psychotic individuals when there's too much of this. By definition, too much is too much, right? But you get the idea. So THC acts as a partial agonist with high affinities for both CB1 and CB2 receptors. And then in brackets, it's got some weird math thing. I don't know what they're talking about there. And auto radiographic and positron emission tomographic studies of the rhesus monkey and human brain have shown high densities of CB1 receptors in the cerebral cortex. Again, this is parts of the brain responsible for smarts, our smarter side. You shut all that down, and what you're left with is the more primal parts of our brain. The reactive, not the proactive, the impulsive, brain parts. Here we go. Brain parts. Some of the names escape me at the moment. Parts of the brain that function. You got. Yeah. Let's have a look. Frontal lobe is part of the outer, the folded, convoluted bit. Central sulcus is again on the outside and all that. All this, most of it on the outer parts of our brain is stuff that doing the smart stuff, if you want to think of it that way. The kind of stuff that is used for social constructs and reasoning and critical thinking, self-analysis. So you got limbic lobe, which is again higher but behind, lower than the outer. And there's one looking for a particular name here. It's not showing me. Primitive parts of brain. There's a certain name I'm looking for. Where is it? Primitive brain functioning. Chase Hughes talks about it in Human Behavior as well. Chase Hughes is a man who's studying human behavior and social constructs and uh, combine it with body language and all this. Oh, what was it called? Don't know. We'll come back to it anyway. It's on the tip of my tongue. I know it's like neocortex and the primal. Let's try that. Because neo means new, and the convoluted cortex outside is the newest parts of our brain. So neocortex. I've searched neocortex and the primal. So neocortex is the most advanced part of the brain, responsible for higher order functions like reasoning, decision making, and this is all what's being atrophied, by the way, and interfered with by THC. The primal brain, often referred to as a reptilian complex, controls basic survival instincts and automatic behaviors. These two parts sometimes conflict. We see a lot of that going on in society, as the neocortex can suppress the more instinctual responses generated by the primal brain. But if the neocortex is damaged, you get more instinctive, emotional responses, vitriolic people who are just emotional, reactive, not proactive, and so on, and act somewhat very animalistic with high levels of paranoia. Anyway, we're hippocampus, brainstem, neocortex, cerebral cortex, neocortex, limbic system, reptilian brain. And that's like a common name for it. The hippocampus. Probably hippocampus I'm looking for is perhaps that was the right wording. Anyway, the more primitive parts of our brain are actually extremely good at observing. When you're talking to somebody the first time and you think, there's something not right about this person. That's the primitive side of your brain trying to tell you something, but it doesn't understand the language that the neocortex, the higher functioning parts of our brain, seem to have evolved to understand. So it can't go and communicate directly. It can give a hint, an emotional hint, a feeling. But the neocortex, well, if you read books on body language, the way something's said, the words that people are using, and what's most likely of that whole combination leading you to a conclusion, it's all needed. But without that, it's like, oh. And what about projection? You don't like the person because there's something about yourself that you don't like, but then you react to it anyway, because especially if your higher thinking is damaged, you react vitriolic response, impulsive, and not really thinking it through. Well, again, this is why people who seem to be primitive tend to project a lot, because they're not thinking things through. They just react. And what's true about ourselves sometimes is, what we accuse others of is really what we're pushing. We're seeing the world through the lens of what's only true about ourselves. This is important to talk about, an important realization of what is this damage via things like THC and other social constructs really doing, because make no mistake about it, it's a very much a subculture among those who are got any smokes, got any weed, and they're in their own little bubble because they're afraid, they end up being so paranoid about the rest of the world. And everybody's a little bit paranoid about the world, but these people are really, really damaging themselves. Um, Bigger picture, people, bigger picture thinking, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't really think of it in that way. Not because, I'm nobody special, but it's just like people in society are told, not told or taught how to think about something. Instead, they're told what to think about things a little bit too much. Not entirely, but there's a mismatch, right? There's an imbalance. And again, such imbalances cause such erroneous approach to ourselves and learning about ourselves and what we ingest and what we put in our blood via smoking or other means, and what ends up in our brain. What is, we really need to understand this system, not from a biological, reading a book of biology, but from the standpoint as individuals of what we're doing to our bodies and how it affects our bodies and so on. Yeah, after all this kind of rant, let's get back to it. Um, so there's these receptors, CB1, CB2. CB1 receptors are shown, uh, where is it? Have shown high densities of CB1 receptors in the cerebral cortex and hippocampus and other parts and cerebellum. This receptor distribution is consistent with the psychoactive actions of THC and thereby with potential effects of cannabis on memory, stress, responsivity, reward, and motivated behavior, as well as self-monitoring. The localizations of cannabinoid receptors are consistent with important roles in reward, reinforcing, and addiction. That's again very important. CB2 receptors are expressed in dopamine neurons of the midbrain ventral tegmental area. So people during smoking some of this, they're gonna feel like the reward system's stimulated. All right, you're gonna feel that reward thing, kind of thing, but they're not really doing anything productive. Um, dopamine, dopamine, by the way, there's CB2 receptors are expressed in dopamine neurons. Um, Dopamine itself is not a neurotransmitter as much as it is a neuromodulator. It modulates the effectiveness of other neurotransmission. This is why you literally feel more awake during that dopamine. It's not a dopamine hit though. Your dopamine's like top of the. You think of the ocean waves moving up and then constantly at a certain level, ebbing and flowing. You can bring it up gently throughout the day if you do certain things, which will ebb back down. You can peak it. I've achieved that, or at least I think I've achieved that. I had no way to directly measure it, but doing certain things that I knew would increase my dopamine levels, I think I've achieved that and combined that with a flush of caffeine, whereas it had more effectiveness on the caffeine because I weaned myself off it, ready for that experiment, using myself as a guinea pig to see what would happen in a safe, controlled way. There's nothing about what I was doing that would be dangerous anyway. Um, so the localizations of cannabinoid receptors are consistent with important roles in reward, reinforcement, and addiction. CB2 receptors are expressed in dopamine neurons of the midbrain, ventral, tegmental area, whatever the, I know, middle of the brain. I don't know what they mean with tegmental. Regardless, again, it's the smart parts of our brain. And what we think of as how we like to think of ourselves as smart because of these things, but really, uh, it's the youngest parts of our brain. Again, the oldest parts of our brain are extremely good at observing, but it doesn't. We don't consciously get this information. But that the most primitive parts know. It knows when something's up, something's amiss. You don't trust somebody. We can't quite put a finger on it. But this is why we need the analytical mind to figure out, why do I feel like this about this person? Maybe I should focus more. That should be your alarm bell to think critically. But if the thinking critically is atrophied because of too much things like THC and maybe head trauma, like your prefrontal cortex damage via a blow to the head, that can equal people surrounding themselves with yes people who say, yes, you're correct, and I know you're right and right, because you're struggling with debate and critical thinking and self analysis because it's atrophied. So, in order to feel more comfortable, what you do is I show myself with yes people because it's too much of a threat and feeling uncomfortable to try and think things through properly. Does that remind you of somebody? That reminds me of somebody, another individual who did have head trauma. Steve McRae, yeah. And yeah, right after the blow to head, right, very quickly surrounded himself with, yes, you're right, Steve. I know, Steve. Um, yeah, but prior to the head trauma, they ended up being a bit of a dysfunctional individual anyway, from what I could tell. And that was the blow to the head was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, I guess. Um, Steve McRae is incapable at this point of critical, productive, progressive thought. Completely incapable. It's just never going to happen. Yeah, if you do have a bloated head and you got memory issues, headaches, go see a doctor immediately because prefrontal damage the side effects of it can be, with medical help, mitigated quite quickly with the right treatment in a lot of cases, maybe not all. But if you just let it go ahead and don't bother, permanent damage can happen further down the line, and you end up seemingly clinically insane. But really, it is insanity when you lose all your reasoning and your critical thinking, and you become lazy about it, and then you repeat anything else that is vitriolic, and you end up being very tribalistic. You end up repeating absurd scripts like um, anything about MAGA doesn't require critical thinking. It's just primal on every level. Ban abortions because we need to breed. It's just primal. It's just, of course, it's not pro life either because ectopic pregnancies are a thing, right? And that's a problem that occurs in pregnancy that will kill the baby as well as the mother. So this is why, to save a life, the mother's life, an abortion would have to be on the cards if you want to be proactive instead of just reactive. Unfortunately, a lot of things in society make good headway, no pun intended, to damage our heads. And this great, amazing computer called the human brain. Said to be officially the most complicated structure known to man. Sometimes I feel like that's debatable on its own. But then, if your brain is that atrophied from head trauma and THC perhaps as well, a combination of things, these people just can't help it. But if you rewind some of that history, it was kind of their fault as well. Uh, and society's fault. It's a whole bigger picture. Everyone's at fault with some of these things. Regardless, let's read on a little bit more. I'm just scrolling through this a bit here and there. But you get the idea. So what is THC actually doing? It's fitting into those receptors that normally get stimulated to do all these natural things like the neuroplasticity, changing neural directions, the connections from one direction to another in the brain, from one neuron to another. But that's not necessarily being stimulated properly to be able to do that and adapt and change so that new structures can be built, new connections in order to aid learning new things. Mr. Black Wolf, I referred to, is incapable. It seems to have proven himself to be incapable of learning anything new. Vitriolically and emotionally and reactionarily, he will go on mantras and claim certain things to be true and has done, seems for years, a couple of years now, about some individuals. And I don't even know why this would be a vitriolic thing. He's vitriolic about it, as if it's a flex. But again, the higher thinking's gone anyway. And you go, oh, this person lives in their mum's basement, as if that was a problem. Many basements in today's world can be changed to look really nice, and apparently, this person's mother's basement is really nice. However, she doesn't live there. But it's that age-old trolling trope, I guess, on the internet. So it's like, say something new, but he's incapable of doing something new. It's the same old nonsense. Very racist as well, it seems, while claiming other people are racist. Again, without the critical thinking to even analyze himself, what's he going to do? If you can't analyze yourself, you're going to project. Inevitable. Everybody projects a little bit here and there. We all do it. But the amount that he just blurts out, you're bad, this person's bad, and he only ever attacks people who tell him he's wrong or how stupid he's being. Again, just like Steve McRae, surrounded himself with yes people, and then he's attacking people who tell him he's wrong on something. It's a common problem across the board. THC atrophies these higher thinking parts of our brain. Steve McRae had an atrophy of higher thinking parts of his brain. Definitely prefrontal damage. He shows all of the signs for it. Those receptors need the natural thing to fit in those receptors. Have I ever used anything that's fitting into my brain receptors that are not really the thing for those receptors? Yes. Caffeine. And everybody has, but it's just by that crash you get after a caffeine high. There's a reason for that, and there's one way to mitigate that crash and have it just ebb off nicely. If you want to use some coffee, strong coffees or mild, whatever, or any beverage with caffeine in, don't use it too early in the day or when you wake up. Wait till you're fully awake. And that means all the adenosine in your brain has been burnt out, used up, because you wouldn't be fully awake if it hadn't all gone. You'd still be a bit sleepy. Then introduce caffeine. Now caffeine fits into those receptors and begins to atrophy a little bit throughout the day So that goes down while your new batch of adenosine slowly builds up. Doing it the other way, having a strong caffeinated beverage too early in the morning, will mean, well, you got all this adenosine floating around not being used up by those receptors, and you're going out through your day like normal anyway. You have a new batch of adenosine being built up, so you get too much adenosine. By the time the caffeine's gone, oh, now the doorway's clear. It's not fitting in the receptor, and guess what? Fits in there now. All that adenosine, and then you go, huh, you're falling asleep very quickly, like someone who's got narcolepsy. And studies on narcolepsy have shown and adenosine processing issues and uh, overproduction and lack of capability of taking it up. Oh, and then suddenly it does take it up. It's whole. They may be, from what I've been reading on that, coming to somewhat of a better, not a cure of that, but a better understanding, a better mitigation of narcolepsy. It's a thing that happens. So narcolepsy, those who don't understand, you'd be talking to somebody, they're fine, alert and awake, and then just like that, they suddenly fall asleep. They suddenly go, and it's very short-lived. They come back around, and they'll be fine again. So those such people need good friends around them that understand that, right? There is a video on YouTube of that happening with people who have gone bowling, and this chap's got the ball. It's like ready to throw it, and he didn't let go. He held on to it and just went forward and flump straight on the floor. Just fell asleep right there. His friends dragged him off, sat him up, carried on playing, and then made sure he's okay. But carried on playing. Come back around, they were just friendly and laughing about it and knew what was going on. So that's pretty cool to have a good friends around you helping you cope with such a thing, right? So, a study of young adults, it says here, found that 20 recreational cannabis users had greater gray matter density than in 20 controls in the left nucleus accumbens, extending to subcolossal cortex. And it is, again, a study of adults found that 20 recreational cannabis users had greater gray matter density than in 20 controls in the left nucleus accumbens extending to subcolossal cortex. Again, what the subcolossal cortex and the left nucleus, I'm not sure. They're laying left and right. It says nucleus, though. It's a very scientific paper. I'm not really familiar. Hypothalamus subtentacular extended amygdala. These are parts of our brain. And left amygdala with shape differences in the left nucleus accumbens and right. My God, it's hard to read. They found higher density in the grey matter, yet a recent large study of two population-based samples in 622 young Australian adults, 66% of them female, and 474 middle-aged United States males found no differences in cannabis users compared with controls in subcortical volumes. But we need to understand what else is the individual doing that can affect their brain as well. Bigger picture, because nobody just people who smoke weed don't just smoke weed, do they? They just I ate some chicken today. It doesn't mean I always eat chicken. It's whatever we ingest, whatever we do to our bodies is going to affect many different things. Other subcortical assessments found that cannabis users had similar or larger cerebellar volumes than non-users. Again, the density doesn't necessarily mean much, and volume is the structure. How are these neurons connected? Because it makes it say like, oh, we use this then, because it makes the brain denser and it's good for your brain neurons. No, that's not the case. Finally, there is some evidence for damage to white matter in specific brain regions of cannabis users as compared with controls, possibly reflecting demyelination of or axonal damage. Axonal damage is the axons, axonal bits are the tendrils coming off a neuron. At the end of those is a bridge gap between one neuron and another. Between that bridge, you get chemical communication. So if those are damaged, yeah, and this is probably why it's being dense, is like trying to compensate what neurons will do in the presence of too much alcohol will create more of those tendrils because alcohol is a suppressant, slowing down those chemical reactions between neurons. Now you've got a problem with um, focusing, processing, thinking straight anyway. So to try and compensate, it tries to create more communication lines. Now coming off alcohol, while that's happening in the brain, sometimes reality seems too real. There's too much processing coming on. So you end up with high levels of emotion peaking up, and or you get really low, real high, almost bipolar like effects, particularly among people who are pretty much alcoholics, right? And you get nervous shakes, all kinds of detrimental effects, more because of dependency, addiction to alcohol. Um, yeah, it's very difficult to read but you get the idea. I'm trying to pull this apart and give it to you. Sure, there's other things I've read are far easier to read, but I'll put the link below. If there is somebody out there far more scientific and collapse this down in a far more layman terminology, great, do it. Um, but it shows that the research has been done, the peer reviews and all this, from one article to another that I've been reading, and they show that THC is bad news. Again, I like to correct myself a little bit, though, is referring to Woodstock. I said it was only 1%. It was between 1 and 5% for most of the Woodstock weed. The famous Woodstock event, right? And that's a tiny drop in the ocean to the high level of the up to 90% THC in some of these cannabis products out there now. Yeah, that's not good at all. So THC, I want to tell you about a little bit more on its. Had a page on that. Hold on a sec. Pain receptors. THC may help relieve certain types of pain by binding to the receptors in the brain and nervous system. It's plugging in to those receptors again. Different receptors are being blocked, and it's like some painkillers do this as well, like drugs, like pharmaceutical drugs. But this can slow pain signals and reduce discomfort. However, the evidence is mixed, and more research is needed to determine its effectiveness compared to other pain management options. Yeah. So, research indicates that THC may be effective at certain types of pain, particularly neuropathic pain. That's pain caused by nerve damage, chronic pain, yeah, different types. Yeah. But the CBD, as I've previously mentioned, yeah, it definitely helps with pain, but preservation of the more natural effects going on in the brain. Preservation of neurons, but not in a way of things like receptors so much either. Bring in the balance, bring back the balance, then you have something far better going on. But we tend to do this with a lot of things. People are talking about no THC or CBD or all THC, no CBD. And you're like, what the hell? And you're not creating anything that is like how nature intended or for these certain chemical reactions. Got us bright. I got a big white page. If I suddenly lit up, that's why. Uh, is CBD alone enough for pain relief? Is another page talking about this. Sometimes, but not always, for neuropathic or treatment resistant pain. Combining with CBD with THC offers greater relief. But you just got to be careful. It's very unnatural. You just would you drink um, terps, which is just pure alcohol, right? No. So why would you drink? Just ingest pure THC. Uh, it's interesting how much detriment there is from THC that can give similar side effects, motor problems, higher thinking problems. Alcohol does all these things, but in a different way. It causes things to go wrong in the brain differently, but the side effect is pretty much the same. Paranoia, irritability, tiredness, lack of energy, lack of sleep, lack of effective sleep. Alcohol can do all these things and so much. Too much THC can does exactly the same. Memory problems. Yeah, does all this. Stop using THC. Thank you for watching. I'm gonna leave it at that. This has proved to be far more complex with the sciencey side of this than I originally thought. But then pmc.nim.nih.gov has always been a bit difficult to read in scientific papers. But I'll put the link below. They have so much out there on not just this subject, or so many other things. Um, Cheers. Take care. Bye.